Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the 2018 design track. The fact that I'm even the fact that I'm even saying that just shows you how much we've grown. The genesis for this track is we're just noticing how you guys are just improving the quality on the platform, and so we needed to get more serious with our material, and this is part of our way of trying to figure that out. So one of the things I know that really comprises of design is aesthetics. And one of the best people I know at Roblox is Stephen Job. Give him a round of applause. He's the 3D lead on the art design team. I personally worked with him on Ready Player One, on the catalog, and many other things. And I think you guys will be in for a treat. So without further ado, Stephen.
Well, that's a lot of people up here. So yeah, guys, are you enjoying RDC so far? Yeah. Nice. This is my first one, both as presenter and just attending it, so it's pretty crazy to see how big this has grown. So my particular talk is going to be about creating immersive and cohesive environments in your game and really achieving that in studio. First going over the general, so think of this as a primer, kind of going over the basics of design when you're making your game, a lot of the big questions and narrowing down. But before I go into that, I kind of want to give you guys an idea of who I actually am. My name is Stephen Job. My handle is Roblox Imagineer. I've worked for Roblox off and on for about 8 years. I've produced a lot of the packages you guys are familiar with, Death Speaker, the Red Cliff Knights, a lot of those things. I've also produced countless gear accessory for the catalog. I've worked on some promotions, like he mentioned RPO. But generally, I've just been part of the asset creation war chest that we've done throughout the years at Roblox. But one thing, while doing that, I've also worked on other projects. I worked on a mobile game called Ninja Time Pirates, which was an absurd game with a wide cast of characters from different time periods. They all had to feel like they belonged in the same universe, so our job was to help breed some cohesion in our design. I also worked on another game called Jetpack Fighter. Again, excuse me. Another game with a broad cast of characters and enemies that needed to feel like they belonged together and separate from each other in terms of bad guy, good guy. I did fan art for Ruby, for Rooster Teeth. In this particular example, I did 2 different styles with the same concept to kind of show how you can breed a different look with the existing product. So the reason why I'm telling you all this is kind of give you guys a primer to what this talk's going to be about and where I come from on this. So the first question a lot of us ask, or I ask you guys to think about, is what makes an immersive world? What makes you feel like you really belong in a game? A lot of people can say whether or not a game looks good, feels like they can dive into it or not, but it's harder for people to actually identify the individual reasons as to why a game is good or bad. Those questions plague developers while making the game too, because you are oftentimes shooting in the dark unless you have a pretty good guidance or a pretty good rule set to base your decisions on. And that's what I'm going to be going over here, first and foremost. Before we start though, I want to talk about thinking big in your design, and in this talk, start broadly with everything you do in your game, and I'll get into more detail about what that means. But you want to think globally with your first big questions. Then you want to go through your game and start using simplified proxies working in a non-destructive and flexible environment so that you can quickly test out every aspect of your game's design before laying down final textures, materials, lighting, everything. The reason why you do this is because oftentimes while you're designing your game, while doing the art, at the same time, you'll find that you need to make these adjustments. And instead of dealing with overly cumbersome assets that you've painstakingly set up, working in a much more raw and flexible manner will get you a better result in the long run. So let's talk about thinking globally. I want to explain what I mean by that. What I mean by globally is to think about the questions or the problems and challenges you're going to face that affect the game at the highest level. That's everything from UI to UX to environment to gameplay design, character design, the general user experience. You want to think about these questions first before you lay down anything in studio. So what are the needs of your gameplay is one of the first questions you want to ask. Basically what that means is, what the heck is your game? What is it going to be about? Like, how is a player going to play your game? The next thing you want to ask yourself is, what's the tone of your game? What do you want to evoke in the player? Do you want them to feel safe? Do you want them to feel frenetic, energetic, like in an obstacle course game? Then you want to kind of think about how your players are going to see the world. This means, like, if it's first-person perspective, the way that the player is going to see the world and the way you need to design your environment is different from if they're in third-person or isometric. So let's talk about that first question. There are many types of games on Roblox. There's obstacle course games. Everyone knows a good Obby. Everyone knows a bad Obby. There are plenty of open world games, sandbox-style games. There are also, guided linear journeys games, and an example of that might be even the Egg Hunt most recently. And then the first-person shooter genre is also very popular on Roblox. We've got some really great games out there for that. Phantom Forces. So let's talk about the first. I'm going to kind of break down two specific examples and how gameplay decisions here affect globally your game. Let's talk about an open world game. One of my favorites out there is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild right now. Yeah, any fans of that game out here? Got a few. Awesome. So this game is a masterclass in design. It uses many points of interest dispersed across this entire environment. But more importantly, it uses obstructions and partial obstructions to both drive players two directions and push them away from others without ever telling the player where to go. In your game, your assets to use, your environment you build should do the same thing. You want your players to really feel like they know where they're going without you having to say a single word. These games also, more than anything else, rely on heavy reuse of assets. Because these worlds are so big, you want to use objects multiple times. And down the road, Roblox will be implementing instancing, which will make this even more powerful because objects will be able to occupy a lot less performance and a lot less load time. So your worlds can become a lot more robust, a lot more vivid, and a lot more real. And open world games will benefit most from that. Next is an obstacle course. Again, a very popular genre on our platform. Obstacle courses, in this case, really need to have a clear play area, and everything else that's in the environment needs to be clearly a set piece. Typically, in most obstacle course games like Donkey Kong Country here, the set pieces or the environment around the player that they're not directly interacting with are usually subdued, pulled back, and a lot less bright and contrasty than the current play space, because you want the player to immediately recognize both the dangers and the opportunities in your environment, while still creating an environment that feels robust and immersive. More importantly, your items, depending on complexity or your performance of your game, need to be one-to-one to their collision. That means if you're worried about performance, pull back on your environmental detail so that your collision is true. Your players will distrust your game if they can't rely on something that they see being something that they're going to hit. Next, this concept, while I'm using a 2D example with Donkey Kong Country, applies in 3D. Again, if you're running down a path, you want your play space to be clear and separate from the immediate points of danger or whatever they need to focus on. So again, that's going to come up a little bit later when I talk about player focus. So the next big question I want to go over is tone. In a game, you can tell a player a lot about how they should feel, what they're about to encounter, the general experience of the game based on tone. This can be great for an obstacle course where you want bright and colorful world around you, or in a first-person game where you want to build a mystery, dark and moody. Light and playful is an example of some of the games like Feed Your Pets that's out there. And then you have mysterious and adventure style games. All of these have different tones, and all of them have different color schemes and treatments of their assets. But again, this is a global question you have to answer before you get to anything else, because this affects not just the environment, not just the character, not just the camera you're looking through the playing the game, but the UI, the general user experience. The next question is a pretty obvious one. When you're developing a game, how is your player going to see the world? Is it going to be a first-person shooter, or even a first-person perspective in general? The way you lay out your environment is going to be very different from, say, how you do a third-person game, where you'd want to have indirect points of interest not immediately in front of the player so that they are forced to explore and look around. In an isometric game, you want to have your immediate foreground midground, which is a play space, and your background to be clear and separated from each other, so a player knows immediately upfront where they can play, what's something they need to be aware of, and what's something's just to help make them feel like they belong in the world. To give you an example how good and bad perspective choices can affect the game, I'm going to use Witcher 3. Witcher 3 is a game that's typically in third person. Anybody here play it before? Yeah, it's a good gun. Yeah. So this game's over the shoulder, and it's very important that it's over the shoulder because it has a lot, especially in combat, you have a lot of points you need to pay attention to. Enemies don't just encounter you from up front. They come at you from all sides, and you typically have to pay attention to more than one thing at a time. That same game played in first person immediately becomes a lot more narrowed. Your focus becomes a lot more tunneled. So your environment, your general approach to the game needs to be slightly different. In the opposite direction, Mirror's Edge is a great game for first-person use. This game right here, you used the first-person perspective to let you know where footfalls were going to happen, where your hands were reaching. They used it very effectively to otherwise communicate a very chaotic game. In third person, you lose a lot of those visual anchors. You lose a lot of that visual cue. You player, you can't tell exactly where they're going to land. In first person, you could. So now that we've kind of talked about the big questions, let's go over again what it takes to make an immersive world in practice. Aesthetically, you want your models to have a consistency in design. That means if they're going to be chunky or thin volumes, if they're going to be complex or very simplified, you want consistency in your mesh. And I'm talking specifically about the model that you have, your environment assets, characters, and everything else, devoid of any color or any lighting. You do want your materials and textures to also be the same. That means the actual materials, your characters, your environment use, the textures, decals, everything else, you want consistency in both complexity and color schemes. And then you want a strong unifying lighting scenario. So regardless if you're using the current state of light or we're talking about Futures Bright, which is just a much better version, you are still working with a lighting system that can help unify or cause discontinuity in your environment. Oftentimes people think about lighting last. It should be one of your first things you think of. So let's talk about model consistency real quick and then kind of break down what I mean by that. What actually makes a mesh? A mesh is essentially what you're looking at here. These two character models and the gear they're carrying right now are meshes. Meshes are the actual models devoid, like I said, of any textures, material, or anything else. That is just the actual physical body of the character. What makes this consistent is whether or not you're going to go on a detailed path or minimalistic. As you can see in the image, you have a very complex character on the left, the pumpkin geist, one of my favorites. And then, of course, Blocky on the right with a very simplified weapon. Their volumes are very different. You have very thin, very complex on the left, very voluminous, large, simplified on the right. And then in most games, one of the most underappreciated things to pay attention to is your silhouettes of your characters or your environment. Silhouettes, what I mean, and I'll explain a little bit more in a bit, is essentially these same models, everything in your environment devoid of any lighting. Silhouettes can communicate a lot to a player about how they should feel. You have a lot of angles, you have a lot of curvature, a lot of organic. It'll feel very different from something that feels very stout, blocky, and very square feeling. Silhouettes are also used oftentimes in games to help communicate what kind of character you're facing. Like Overwatch, for instance, the silhouettes for all of the characters drastically different from each other. If you took out all their color and you just made them black, flat images, you would be able to tell what each class and what each character is at a glance. So let's kind of put this in practice real quick. We've got Blocky here in a very odd environment. He's a very voluminous, very large, chunky character in an environment that's very thin, very detailed. It doesn't feel like it meshes quite right. However, if we put him in an environment that has very similar levels of volumes, very similar level of detail, he immediately feels like he's made out of the same stuff that the world he exists in. This is very important because your player, who is either the guy on the right or the guy on the left, is going to have a very different experience when they're in the world. They'll feel like they belong here or they don't. Let's use another example in the other direction. Pumpkin Geist, again, very thin character, very complex in shape. With the blocky volumes, has a similar problem in the other direction. You immediately put him in an environment where he has the same level of detail. Again, he feels like he's made out of the same stuff. He feels like he exists in the same world. going to the silhouettes that I mentioned earlier. Silhouettes are very powerful for communicating to you as the developers whether or not you've got cohesion. And then with silhouettes, I'm trying to strip out all of the additional noise, the lighting and everything else, so you can focus on just how everything looks together. If you look at the left and you look at the right, the two have very different silhouettes, very different shapes. The one on the left's a lot more straight lines, a lot more simple shapes in it. The one on the right's got a lot of thin volumes, a lot of repeated, detailed curvature. This is what I'm talking about when I say model cohesion, model consistency. Now that we talked about the mesh, I want to kind of go ahead and get into the texturing, the colors, and everything like that. But I'm going to talk about colors first because it's a very almost global choice as well. It impacts tone and everything like that. So before we even get to the minutia of textures, let's talk about color and why it matters. Color can do a lot to set tone and set mood in your game. It can tell your players, again, whether or not they're in a sci-fi environment or if they're in a colorful, like fantasy environment. It can tell them where they need to go or what they need to ignore. It can also do a lot to enhance the lighting of your game. So if you have a game that has, with current state of lighting, which is fairly robust, it has some limits. The assets and colors you choose in the environment can help enhance that further, where you may not be able to quite get the color red you want. Like in Neon District, they used it very effectively by choosing these colors very deliberately on their assets. Now, I'm going to kind of go through how other games approach color and how that helps set tone. Deus Ex, anybody here play that? Yeah, of course, a lot of people have. It's a great game, right? Deus Ex uses a very muted, subdued tone to create this sort of distressed, aged environment that feels very different from something like Mass Effect, which uses much more color and colors that you don't typically see in your normal environment to make it feel like you're in an alien world. Legend of Zelda uses very warm greens and soft tones to make you feel safe in a game that's otherwise pretty dangerous. And if any of you guys have ever played games, you kind of know when you feel safe, and that's usually because the developers intentionally chose color, lighting, and the general tightness of the atmosphere so you feel safe. Another example is Resident Evil. For a game that's generally pretty dark and scary, these safe zones are usually much brighter lit and warm. Ori does this as well in a game that typically has some pretty, it uses color very effectively, by the way. If you guys want another masterclass on gameplay design, character design, this is another one. It uses color very effectively to teach you both what enemies are and what kinds of enemies are, and I'll get into that more in a minute. So when you're developing a game, you want to kind of figure out, for consistency's sake, a similar hue, a basic hue that you're going to develop your game in. The reason why this matters is you look in this room, look around you real quick, and look at the dominant colors you see in this room. Even on your own shirts, on everyone around you, it tends to be a little brown, a little bit warmer in here. It's because the lighting and the environment around you is reflecting light. The light that's coming off these isn't the only light that's hitting you. That's breeding cohesion in your environment because it's real. So you want to do the same thing here. While your game can be colorful, keep in mind that these things exist together and they will be bouncing off each other, playing off each other constantly. You also want to use complementary colors or higher contrast to help draw focus. I'll show you exactly what I mean about that in just a minute, but it can be very useful to immediately tell the player where they need to look, where they need to go, or what they need to be afraid of. And you want to choose generally a similar level of saturation. Oftentimes, we'll use the best asset or what we think looks great by itself. This tree looks fantastic. You've got this wonderful looking character over here. This building looks great, but you have to think about your environment holistically, everything together, because nothing exists in a vacuum when you're making a game. So to give you an example of how color can help drive player focus, let's use Mirror Edge again. Mirror's Edge. If we blur this image, you can immediately tell where the focus of the play is right now. The higher, brighter reds stand out greatly from the surrounding, much cooler, softer whites that are behind it. So even if you can't really clearly see what's going on, you already know what you want to focus on. By our very nature, we tend to focus on something that stands out. For instance, your yellow shirt stands out really well. It's popping. Enemy designs, like I mentioned in Ori, they use color to immediately make them recognizable, not just from the environment, but from each other. Because oftentimes, you will have different enemies, and you need to know at a glance what you're about to face. This game and other games like it that use color make you feel smart, tell you what you're about to encounter without ever saying a word. Another great game is Ni no Kuni. It uses color very effectively to generate a path. In a cityscape that's generally pretty hectic, it uses the brightness of the road that your character is walking on, surrounded by a much more dimly lit, less saturated environment to let the player know kind of where the play space is, where they can walk. This can be very effectively used in Obbies. This is an example of where the play space is brighter, more clear, and the environment, the set piece behind it is much dimmer. So the player knows where they are, where they can play, and what's just for pretty. Now that we talked about colors holistically and how they can drive player focus and how they can also diffuse player focus and how they can kind of set mood and really let your player know where they're at. Let's talk about specific texture. Roblox has a robust toolbox. Developers, you guys can all upload textures and stuff like that. Oftentimes we will think about the texture that we want on a particular item, but before you do that, you want to think about how this is going to work, again, holistically. Is your texture library that you use in your game, the decals that you use, the overlays that you use on your UI, are they going to be photorealistic or cartoony? You want to kind of figure out your palette early as possible. Again, this could be per zone, but generally speaking, you want to figure out the tone of your game, the palette. And by palette, I mean the general color range you're looking at for your game. And then you also want to decide early on if you want to use baked-in or real-time lighting. Studio has a fantastic real-time lighting system, and I would encourage you guys to use it. But sometimes actually painting in or baking in your lighting, either through a third-party tool or whatever method you want, can help enhance otherwise. For instance, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, the HD version, they implemented a dynamic lighting system, but they also used baked-in lighting to help enhance that further, where they knew there was going to be no change in lighting. Real time was used wherever it was subject to change. Now, to kind of talk about how this works in practice, let's take a look at those two examples. First, we'll take a look at an extremely simple and fairly unified color scheme. The environment here all uses very flat colors. That generally is a very green hue. The objects all have the same level of detail. The character is a little bit more detailed than the rest of the environment because it's the one that I want you to focus on in this case. There's no painted lighting in this environment, and it's also generally the same level of saturation. Now, we go a different direction, a much more detailed way. We have this character in an environment that's much more detailed, much more colorful, in a broader range of colors, but it's still unified. You still have purples and oranges as the dominant colors. You have green in there for the ground, but even it's subdued so that the highest contrast is on your characters and anything you want focus on. Now that we've talked about textures, we've talked about meshes, kind of talked about the high-level stuff, I want to talk about lighting because it's oftentimes, at least in my opinion, one of the most disregarded things. It's considered last minute, a polish. It should never be considered polish. Your very core can help root everything together or cause it to feel like it doesn't belong. So, a great example is the image to the left, or to the, my left, your right. It's Toy Story. In this, it's a great example of what I'm talking about. These toys here were developed and manufactured from different manufacturers. They were meant to feel like they came from different places, and different families have different stories behind them. However, the lighting, materials, and everything else that they used helped bring them back together. You have fur, you have plastic, all these things still feel like they belong in the same world because they spent time to make sure the lighting helped root them together. They also used lighting in other movies like them to help set the tone of the environment, whether or not they want to feel fun and playful, or is this something I need to be afraid of? I'm going to show you guys 4 examples of the same scene with different lighting to kind of express what I mean. All 4 of these examples are using the exact same scene. This is using the current state of lighting, or current state of studio's lighting. I'm going to show you an example later that can be both done in current state and the future is bright. But this can be done in current state. This image right here, the only things that have changed are the directions of the lights, the skybox, and that's it. So the top left image is default when you drop right into the pirate's default scene. The top right, I just shifted it to nights, messed with some of the latitude and the lighting settings, and immediately have a different scene. Bottom left, changed the skybox again, adjusted the lighting so it enhanced the skybox and matched it, and again, my environment feels very different. Bottom right, sunset, same concept. Again, just adjust your lights, adjust your skybox, and immediately everything in your world feels like it belongs together and is rooted in the same world. To give you guys some great examples of Roblox games that have used lighting and, in general, everything I've talked about very effectively, let's take a look at 4 examples. First, Feed Your Pets is a great example of a game that used very simplified, very chunky environment, very blocky look. It uses it in every level, from the size of the environment itself to individual assets, or even the spots on the giraffes. It's not textured, it's all modeled in. We also have a game like 2029, which represents a much more realistic, much more distressed take. The lighting is much more subdued, not so bright. The textures and the materials are a lot, like I said, more distressed, so it feels aged and a little, kind of futuristic. We take this game right here, Rip Your Toaster. It's a great cathedral scene that it feels dilapidated, old, but still comfortable. And I really want to point this one out because this one on the top right one used lighting, the current state of lighting, to create a lot of depth in your scene, which is very important for helping your player know how big the environment is. And in this case, in the bottom left, whether or not it should feel safe or not. And then a game that uses lighting a little less aggressively, but still uses it effectively along with materials and textures, is Bootleg Buccaneers. It uses this to create a similar level of detail so your environment and everything in it feels like it belongs together. Even characters a lot of times will feel like they belong despite how they look. Now that I've kind of gone over the basics, now that I've kind of talked about everything else, the high level, narrowing down to the specific examples like color and lighting and texture, I want to kind of show you guys an example of how this works in practice. So I built a basic demo scene to show you this whole thought process from the beginning to end. So first, I wanted to figure out what my game was going to be. In this case, it was going to be a first-person sort of adventure game. I looked at games like Destiny and whatnot for a reference on this one. I drew up a really rough, really quick top-down view of how the gameplay was going to play out with different points of interest, general idea where the lighting was going to be, and my primary point of interest or my primary focus. After that, I wanted to think about the next global level thing, which was tone, color, and the general mood I wanted to produce with this game. This was very important because I wanted my player to both feel the mystery of the scene, but also comfortable. Next, once I kind of figured out those high-level things, I wanted to put it in practice. And by doing that, I used what I mentioned earlier, which is called Greyboxing. So what I did is I grabbed toolbox assets or whatever I had, simple primitives in some cases, and slapped them together into a scene while keeping it very fast and flexible. These objects were literally just things I threw in and pulled out the textures and the materials from, so that I could kind of figure out and test whether or not my concept worked. And I found out that I didn't even make modifications here and there. I needed to move trees around, move my points of interest, everything, so that I could kind of force the player to look a direction without ever having to tell them to do so. This, again, helped me test for mobility and focus as well. I found out that a couple of times I needed to pull back the skybox, for instance. So after I kind of figured out the grayboxing, figured out that my gameplay generally worked, I wanted to go ahead and start setting about to set the tone, set the mood of my game. To do that, I used the wonderful Futures Bright system that we have in Works, but this concept still applies with the current state of lighting as well. So I went ahead and set up the lighting in my scene. Started with broad level, high level, like just kind of figure out where the direction the light was going to come from. And in my concept, I had the light generally behind the primary point of interest. found out that that detracted from the point of interest. So I moved it off from where the player was going to be looking initially, so that the brightest and highest contrast in the scene was this single object in the background. I used it to also set the tone that I had, which again was supposed to be mysterious and drive player exploration. And again, at this point, I still avoided over-encumbering myself with textures and materials. Again, when I've said that people treat lighting as polish, and I don't think you should, this is why. I can already tell what the scene, the tone, and everything I'm trying to build with this environment before I even start setting down specific things. Now, once I've done all that, once I've tested and verified, once I've refined and moved things around and really felt like I was happy with where I was at, I set about refining and polishing the scene. In this, I used simple trees because I wanted to keep the same reinforced, blocky, chunky environment that I had overall. I used the lighting to help bring down the brightness of the environment immediately around the player, so that the object in the background, the pillar itself, was the brightest and clearest object to the player. Now, I never told the player they can't go straight ahead, but when a player jumps into this, the first thing they're going to see, the highest point of interest, is this, which is there to encourage them to go there. That's how you want your game to feel. That's what immersion is. It's never about telling the player where you want to go. It's about using your environment, using your assets, and all those choices to drive them there and let them get there on their own. Now, before I get to the thank you, I want to appeal to each one of you guys. The reason why I wanted to set this presentation up is Roblox is a community of great games and great developers. We can all work together to become better and help each other by helping our individual games. By putting focus into the design of your game and your own individual assets, your own world, you are helping your neighbor is helping you. And as we elevate the Roblox visual platform, how everything looks to an external user who knows nothing about Studio, the popularity of individual games and Studio becomes greater. So what you're doing is not only helping your game look better, you're helping it do better. So in my thanks, I also want to point out several games that are great examples of both lighting, textures, materials, general aesthetic choice, and cohesion in the environment. For instance, Neon District was a great example. I used it pretty heavily. Bootleg Buccaneers is a great example of textures and materials. Life of an Otaku is great about setting tone, mood with your lighting. Innocence, again, the same thing. It used it very effectively also to scare you and drive the player's focus from place to place. And then Egg Hunt used it very effectively, everything very effectively, to help you feel these very different worlds, but you still felt like you were playing one big game. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask, but my handle right here is Roblox Imagineer, and I am on Twitter that I set up like 3 days ago, so there's not a lot up there. And then, of course, on Roblox. So I'm open to any questions if you guys have any. Sweet. I like this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, Deepak.
Yeah. Hi. What are the games that you grew up with that drew you in and made you want to be who you are today?
So one of the earliest examples I can think of is Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. It was the game itself was still to this day holds up because they spent a lot of time making sure that everything in their game felt like it was made of the same stuff, the materials, the trees, everything felt like they belonged together. So that's a great example to me. Mass Effect did it really well. Mirror's Edge is a great example of that kind of stuff. I can go on, but there's a lot of games that I pick out things that at the time I knew they were great games, but I didn't know why. I didn't know why they appealed to me visually until I really started thinking about these questions and the questions they themselves asked them and answered in those games. Yeah. Yes. Hang on. Yeah.
What software do you use to bake objects?
What do you mean, like lighting and everything like that? So if you want, again, you want to use real-time lighting when you can, but if you use baked in, you can either use XNormal, you could use Maya, Blender, all have the capability of baking in lighting. You just set up a lighting rig. Or in my case, I typically like to just go ahead and use 3D Coat or ZBrush or any kind of program where you can paint on the model, and I paint in the shadows. Yeah, my personal preference is to do painted because I like that discrete control. Anybody else? No? Awesome. Yes.
You were showing where you do a lot of 3D design. Have you had practice doing any 2D design?
Yeah, yeah. So when I did 2D design, the same concepts typically applied here, doing sprite work or, in fact, Jetpack Fighter, while being a 3D game, was treated in a 2D environment. So we realized, and I can see if I can go back to it real quick. Give me a second, guys. I want to actually use this as an example. When we first designed this game, we realized we ran into problems where readability was, I can click on it eventually. Readability was important, but we wanted to have the ability to manipulate the camera on the fly. So it was more like 2.5D, but we applied the same concepts we did here. The environment, as you can see, is much more subdued, especially when you get to the background. In fact, there's almost just flat shapes because we wanted the immediate play space of where the characters were to be the thing that you focused on. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes, Deepak. Other Deepak, not the same one.
Going into your background, what kind of things did you study or type of schooling you went to get to where you are now?
So I went to school for media arts and animation because I didn't know what I wanted to do. At the time, I was like, I want to work at Pixar. I didn't want to work at Pixar. I wanted to work in games, but I knew that I wanted to work in art, and I went to school for that because it was very broad. I thought we learned about sculpture, we learned about how lighting impacts things, we learned about general color theory. So it helps to just look at these things that you wouldn't immediately associate with games. In fact, there's a GDC demo I point out over here. They talk about interior design and how it impacts environment design, because these concepts applied in games work just like they do in the real world. So a lot of the stuff that I did was real world media, and then I moved into digital after that. Any more? Yes.
For doing game design and everything, and let's say you're doing it just as assets, you don't want to be the one doing any of the scripting, how do you recommend getting your foot into the industry?
So oftentimes, or if we want to talk about Roblox, that's a hard question to answer. It's different for each area, but you want to try to either go in as an intern at some of these places or as a prop modeler. Prop modeler is usually the low level. You're creating basic assets, but one teaches you the pipeline specifically for that game, how that company operates, but it also kind of gets you generally aware of how the process works in games. So prop modeling is usually a good place to start. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you were showing like the Blackie character that was with like the slimmer like tree and that like more detailed sword, it almost looked like, well, to me personally, I kind of liked the look of that a lot because it looked like the character didn't fit into the world, yet he still did. So have you like seen any games that have been able to use the idea of like breaking the rules of lighting and all of that stuff in color? And what are some examples of that, and how can you like break the rules while making it good within the rules, I guess?
So that's a good question. I can't think of a game right off the top of my head, but there are games that use it very effectively. Even in those games, though, there's usually something, like I mentioned about 4 or 5 things that you can use to unify your game. Even those games they never break the rules, they bend them. They break them for 1 or 2 things. The models might look different. The textures might look different, but they still use the lighting that's the same. They still use the materials that are the same, because they're still trying to breed a world that feels like it's immersive, even if they're breaking their own rules. I can, put up on Twitter, once I can think of them, some examples of particular games that do that. Oh, yeah.
Mario Odyssey, the world with the city.
Oh, yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, the New Donk City is a great example of them sidestepping that issue. You have Mario, who's supposedly human, and he's in an environment that looks very human. But instead of ever actually confronting that directly, they just built a game that looked like it was built off the same stuff. Like the characters looked different, the environment looked different, but still looked like it was built off the same stuff. And I want to point out specifically, the game used lighting very effectively to make it still felt like it belonged together. Toy Story is a great example again.
When I'm often building maps, I find it hard to cut off the zone where the player is supposed to go. What are some good ways to do that? Like often I'll make it on an island, so there's nothing else for them to walk towards, but I tend to overuse that. So what are other ways to limit the area they can explore?
So the first thing I would do is discourage. And by that I mean build an environment that looks like there's no reason to go there. Two, obscurance. You want to use objects to make it feel like they can't get there. Yes, players will still try to go there, and you might want to mitigate that with either invisible colliders or something like that. But again, like Breath of the Wild and games like that, they encourage you and discourage you based on obscurance and deterrence, or deterrence. So basically the items don't look like there's something of interest. The thing just looks like it's clearly in the distance, and there's something immediately blocking your path, say a building, hills, dense tree coverage. That kind of stuff can be used to create guide rails that aren't actually boundaries. Also, I want to point out lighting can be useful there as well. You can use a dimmer lighting, light up the areas that's play-based, make the dimmer space something that doesn't necessarily feel like it should be of interest. All these things can be used to drive interest to one area and deter interest from another area. And if you do those two together, you should be able to provide your players a space they feel like they belong in, and a space they feel like they don't really want to bother with. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so a lot of games recently I found I don't like the way they look because, for instance, Mario Odyssey is another example. They have the play space in the world, and then there's just a skybox, and you can kind of just see where the world falls off. And I've noticed that a lot recently, and I think it kind of goes along with what he's asking about how to get the world to
Feel like it's seamless or endless?
Yeah, feel like it's endless, but put a boundary still without having that drop off into the edge. And Breath of the Wild is another example because on one side you have the ocean, which is great, and on the other side you have mountains that you can't climb. But on the very top there's a big chasm that never looked right.
Yeah, it always felt like there
So-
should have been something on the other side.
Yeah, so tips for...
So you kind of pointed out a couple tips. They didn't do it in all their areas, but for one, they used high environment that was very vertical, so the player didn't feel like they could actually climb it. The player through that game knew how far they could climb, and they saw something that was well out of their range. They were discouraged from going there. Then it, of course, used physical blockers like invisible colliders and warnings saying you can't go any further that direction. Ocean was another example. The player knew they could swim a certain distance. They made that distance insurmountable. You could not cross that water. So you want to kind of create those subtle, intuitive limitations through either something that feels like it's just too far for them to go, too far for them to ever consider going. Like, what's down there that really matters? And then to create an endless environment, usually what I suggest doing, and in the environment I did, I created some hills that created a sense that the environment was going up and then back down, so they would never see the end of the world. And then I just layered that with simplified objects that were so far out that the sky fog or the depth fog was making it feel like it was just endless. But these objects were just, in fact, in the very distance, they were just spheres. Just spheres in the distance and cubes that were off in the distance. They were so far out the player didn't feel like they could get to them, but they still helped make it feel like it went on almost endlessly. All right, cool. That's all the time I've got for. I can answer your question offline if you'd like. Like I said, take a look at GDC demos. Take a look at the future RDC demos. I'm hoping we can do more of these in the future. And if you guys have questions, specific things you want to go over, just let us know because next year we might want to do more specific talks. Thank you guys so much.